As F. Scott Fitzgerald put it, here's a new generation which has lost its moorings. It's grown up to find all gods dead, and it seeks new meaning. And sometimes it finds that new meaning in relativity, and sometimes it finds that new meaning in radical political ideologies, such as fascism or communism.
Colonel Thomas Gowanlock served as an intelligence officer in the American 1st Division, the expeditionary force that goes over to France in World War I. He's on the front line, November 11th, 1918, and wrote of his experience later. On the morning of November 11th, I sat in my dugout in our division headquarters, talking to our chief of staff, Colonel John Greeley. A signal corps officer entered and handed us the following message. Official radio from Paris, 6:01 a.m., November 11th, 1918. Marshal Foch to the Commander-in-Chief. 1. Hostilities will be stopped in the entire front beginning at 11 o'clock. November 11th, French hour. 2. The Allied troops will not go beyond the line reached at that hour on that date until further orders. My watch, Gowanlock continues, said 9 o'clock. Only 2 hours to go. So he drives from the bank of the river to see this great finish. But during this time, the last 2 hours, it's not like people are sort of, hey, there's an armistice coming, let's get ready. The shelling was heavy, and as Gowanlock walked down the road, it grew steadily worse. It seemed that every battery in the world was trying to burn up its guns, he said. Numerous American units, the 32nd and 33rd Army Divisions, the 5th Marine Regiment, were ordered into combat that morning and suffered serious losses. In the 5 hours between the announcement of the armistice and the actual event, the two sides suffered a combined 10,944 casualties, including 2,738 dead. The fighting went on to get revenge, to use up leftover ammunition, to teach the enemy a lesson. Among those was a young captain, Harry S. Truman, who was enthusiastically firing during this time. I fired 164 rounds at the enemy before he quit this morning. I'm for peace, but that gang should be given a bayonet piece and made to pay for what they've done to France. In fact, when Gowanlock starts, his walk around and you hit that 11th hour, firing continues. Men on both sides had decided to give each other all they had, their own farewell to arms. Many soldiers believed the armistice would only be a temporary measure, and the war would go on. As night comes, it's quiet. Men sat around log fires. They had never used these before because that would be signaling the enemy where to send the shells. Now they could. And they talked in low tones. Gowanlock said their minds were numbed by the shock of peace. The Germans, said one British corporal, came from their trenches, bowed to us, and then went away. That was it. There was nothing with which we could celebrate, except cookies. The events that would lead to that event, the armistice, which was so surprising to even many people on the front, would be a meeting in a forest in France. It's in a railroad car, and it's allowed through the front. The day had been coming at least since August 8th, 1918. The Black Day, it was called, of the German army, when 15,000 German men surrendered on the same day, the day of a French and British offensive. Germany had lost Bulgaria, lost Turkey, lost Austria-Hungary, which was suing for its own peace. On the first day of autumn, the German General Ludendorff calls his staff officers together to a meeting. The Western Front could break at any moment. Germany's allies have already folded or will soon be forced to surrender. A combination of Arab and British Empire forces captures Damascus. Istanbul is wide open. The German army, poisoned with communist and socialist ideas, cannot be relied upon. The real enemy now is revolution. In consequence, the general tells his staff, the German High Command has recommended to the Kaiser that Germany sue for peace. Having resisted such a decision for weeks, Ludendorff is now adamant that it must happen immediately. At the announcement, some begin to weep. A few find themselves holding each other's hands so tightly they feel they might break. The general has only a few final words left to add, but these are political. They will weigh heavily in the future. He has recommended to Wilhelm that any new German government be made up of those responsible for putting us where we are today. The socialists and pacifists will be forced to make the peace. They must be made to drink the soup they have brewed. The lieutenant grabs the general's arm. Is this the last word? Am I alive or am I dreaming? God has wished it so, replies the general. I see no other escape. That evening, a birthday party for Hindenburg, another German general, goes ahead as planned. As is traditional, there are drinking, songs, and dancing, but all those present know that they are witnessing the end of an era. One of Ludendorff's close associates whispers in the general's ear, "You and I will be hanged someday." There's a haphazardness to the end of the war that didn't seem to match the length and cruelty of it. A war that began in 1913 and set the continent of Europe, along with fighting in many other continents across the world, but set the continent of Europe on fire. It also involved the United States. And we often don't think about the effect on the United States, but my guest that I'll have on today will talk a bit about that. It would leave Russia from a kingdom, an empire, into a country in a bitter civil war between Bolshevik communists and the White Army. The revolution that would spread in Russia would have elements in Germany. There would be communist revolutions and attempts in Italy, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. In England, there wouldn't be a communist government, but the Labour Party, once a kind of joke party from the 1890s, representing labor unions, will have its first Labour prime minister. Ireland is separated from the United Kingdom, declares a free state. In the United States, there's strikes, there's race riots. Really, to be clear, there's attacks on black people and black communities in various towns across the country. There's a huge recession. There's a flu epidemic. There's conversion of previous kingdoms into very unstable democracies. There's new countries created at the peace table. There's American involvement in European affairs in a way that there had never been. And, at the same time, you're having developments in physics. Einstein's theory of relativity comes out in this time. In psychology, Freud and his psychoanalysis becoming more popular. Sigmund Freud is a Austrian and is experiencing the ups and downs of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In art, there's Cubism, there's Dada, there's Surrealism, all these new expressive forms. In music, there's jazz. That's why I'm pretty excited to be able to talk to Charles Emmerson, the author of Crucible, The Long End of the Great War and the Birth of a New World, 1917 to 1924.
Whereas traditionally we tend to think, certainly in Britain and France, the United States, of the World War ending in November 1918. Of course, that's why we commemorate Armistice Day on November the 11th.
His book, over 600 pages, is going to focus on those years, and important years they are.
In fact, across much of Europe, the war really doesn't end so neatly in 1918 at all. It kind of fragments into these series of other conflicts and revolutionary events and civil wars, wars of independence, and even wars between different states, which continue across the European continent.
Summer 1918. Russia's cities are starving. People struggle to stand up straight from hunger. Skin becomes translucent, as if made of wax. The question of how to fill one's stomach dictates everything else. Berlin. German soldiers return home to find cold hearths and hungry mouths. The new chancellor worries about their morale, concerned they will fall in line with the communists. In Berlin, he greets them in person with a speech. "Comrades," he begins, "welcome back to your homeland which has so longed for your return, and for which you have experienced such anguish." He lavishes praise on the superhuman deeds of the rank and file. "You have kept the murder and fire of war away from your wives, your children, your parents." In some parts, it sounds like a victory speech. In others, it sounds like a plea for help.
Well, the German situation in 1918 is really fascinating, and it's remarkably different, of course, from the situation in 1945, because in November 1918, German troops are actually in France and Belgium. There are very few Allied troops actually in Germany. That becomes a very, very major factor later on, because it means that political leaders in Germany who call for peace, many of them call for peace in November 1918 because they know that German society is stretched, it's exhausted, it can't really go on. If it goes on, there'll be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands more killed. Will that actually bring victory? Probably not. But the consequence of German troops being in France and Belgium and not on German soil, not being pushed back to Berlin, is that subsequently people can say, well, was the German army really beaten in the war? Or was it, in fact, there was a moral collapse behind the lines? The facts on the ground, if you like, create the possibility of a narrative of being the Germany was essentially stabbed in the back. Mm-hmm. That socialists or others were responsible for this defeat, really, that it wasn't the fault of the army. And this is across the political scene. So, in November 1918, when you've got German troops coming back from the front, streaming back into German cities, which are very, very hungry. There's a lot of disease, a lot of poverty. There's still a blockade against Germany. You find German politicians greeting them back almost as victors. And that sense of a victory which has been stolen from them really enters the German psyche very early in that post-war period in November 1918.
Yeah, and it seems like you've got a couple, it wasn't so obvious who would take over. The Kaiser's in Holland and is still making moves and considering that maybe he could be put back, even if it's with a socialist chancellor or something like that. You have the socialists who are declaring a republic, and you have Ludendorff making moves and trying to find someone to perhaps put him into power, the German general. And there could even be more that I missed here.
Well, it's extraordinary the way that timing and chance play such an important role when you have a situation of chaos. So in the case of the German Republic, you literally have the Kaiser's over in Belgium. This is in November 1918. The Kaiser's in Belgium. He's the news coming in from Berlin is very unclear. It's unclear what's happening in the capital. And then in Berlin itself, you have a communist leader who's about to proclaim a communist republic in one part of Berlin, and then a socialist leader who, hearing about this, says, well, actually, I better go ahead and preempt that by proclaiming a republic before the communist guy. And so as a result of this chain of information and confusion about what's going on, a republic is proclaimed before actually what becomes the Weimar Republic is essentially proclaimed before many people anticipated or even wanted it.
And it's interesting to see, currently with our current politics in America, where there's a lot of focus on socialism and equating socialism to communism, that, you have this example in the post-World War I Germany, where it's actually the socialists that preempts the communists and their active political opponents. As one reads Crucible, it hits me as a reader seeing these characters that come to play. I mean, you have a young African-American woman, Josephine, who's escaping race riots in East St. Louis, and we know what's going to happen with her. And on a darker side, we have a young German army person, named Adolf, who's trying out slowly but surely different speeches. First trying maybe he can attack capitalists and imperialists, or just attacking the men at the table at Versailles, and then maybe he can attack Bolsheviks and Russians, and then finally settling that one of his better arguments in the Munich street fair politics of the day to get attention is to start attacking Jews and be more and more anti-Semitic.
Well, one of the things I'm really trying to get across in this book, and why I've written it the way I've written it in the present tense, is to get a sense of real immediacy to what's going on, so that just to place the reader in Berlin or in St. Petersburg or in London or in Chicago or wherever, but also to follow the development of these characters, to follow the trajectory. So if you take somebody like like Adolf Hitler, who is one of the characters in the book. With a character such as Adolf Hitler, it's, on the one hand, it's extraordinary that he was able to rise from a position of such unimportance in 1917, but also you see the way in which he is, as you say, he's trying out these different lines, the extent to which he is in a sense made by his public. And I think that's quite you see these games of a sort of call and response, the sort of the dog whistles, which he uses in his speeches, where he'll start by saying these people are so awful that maybe they should be, and then his audience will cry out hanged, and he'll say, oh well, I'm not sure they should be hanged, but it's the classic dictator's playbook of allowing your audience, your supporters, to say the things that you can't say, to say the things that you can think but can't say. That's a very interesting thing to observe through these years.
Vienna. Freud smokes his last cigar and immediately suffers the ill effects of its absence. Since then, I have been grumpy and tired, got heart palpitations and an increase in the painful swelling of my gums, he writes to a colleague. But Freud is lucky. Help is at hand. Then a patient brought me 50 cigars. I lit one, became cheerful, and the gum irritation rapidly abated. Freud's patients talk of nothing but guilt. Sigmund himself begins to wonder out loud whether he will last the war. Albert Einstein writes to a friend, would it not be good for the world if degenerate Europe were to wreck itself totally? All of our exalted technological process, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. And it's a fragmented time, the collapse of Germany and its war effort, and at the same time the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, which had been so long a fixture of Europe, and just the devastation of war, and at the same time the scientific developments, most notably the theory of relativity that you point out, that did start to enter into the political. Science is attacked by politics in a way. It was political to be for relativity.
Well, before the First World War, Einstein is a pretty marginal figure. He's already generated his theories of relativity, but they haven't really entered into the cultural ether of the age. In 1919, he's essentially proved right. There's the two scientific expeditions which essentially prove that his estimations of the physics of the universe are more accurate than those of Newton. And there is this quite extraordinary upswelling of interest in Einstein as a scientist and in this notion of relativity, which is, of course, almost immediately perverted. It's taken out of the context of physics and taken into politics and society and everything else. And, Einstein himself refers to this as a kind of mass psychosis. But I think it's very reflective of an age where people have, as F. Scott Fitzgerald put it, here's a new generation which has lost its bearings, it's lost its moorings. It's grown up to find all gods dead, and it seeks new meaning. And sometimes it finds that new meaning in relativity, and sometimes it finds that new meaning in radical political ideologies, such as fascism or communism.
Just a reminder, I'm talking with Charles Emmerson, the author of Crucible, The Long End of the Great War, and the Birth of a New World. Over 600 pages of just vignettes and interesting information. Because of that, there's so many places we could go with this. We'll talk about a few topics that are just because they happen to be in the news recently. Like one of the areas of disruption among many in Europe is Ukraine.
Yes.
And maybe you could talk a bit about the history of Ukraine always kind of being at the whim of the stronger powers.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, Ukraine is a battleground after the formal end of the Great War. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Ukraine is still a battleground between different factions in Russia's civil war, which is ongoing at that time. But also after 1917, you find that the Germans and the Austrians sweeping into Ukraine and viewing that as the potential breadbasket for their war effort. Kiev changes hands an extraordinary number of times in the years 1917, 1918, 1919. Very briefly, there is in fact an independent Ukraine, that's to say independent of Russia. And it's that Ukraine to which the current Ukrainian regime looks when they think of their own the pedigree of their own historical existence. But of course, very swiftly, Ukraine is subsumed within the resurgent Soviet Empire. And I think that, the story of Ukraine constantly being subject to the whims of greater powers, of outside powers, that's a story which goes deep to how Ukrainian politicians understand the fragility of their own statehood, because it has been fragile for such a long period of time.
Yeah, and talk about Russia a bit, because Russia's revolution is going on. It's a product of the war. I mean, Lenin's sent back to Russia by the Germans. Some suggest it was kind of a secret weapon, although it certainly had effects all over the place, not just in Russia. But they're fighting it out. And and I like how your book discusses the various movements. You have Trotsky kind of out there in one area. Stalin is doing some things in the background at first, and Lenin has his type of revolution. And there's a lot of conflict about what that revolution's going to be about. And also you see quickly the movement, even in the first years, sense that this is going to be about one-man rule, or very few men ruling, versus real workers' communes. Well,
that's right. I mean, if you look at where Lenin is, and this is one thing which it comes through in the book, I think a lot, is that how unlikely many of the events that occur really are, how many of the rises and falls are. And of course, Lenin is a classic example of that, because in 1917, early 1917, you find him in Zurich, living above a butcher's, and occasionally he gets various revolutionaries together in one of the local bars in Zurich, and he sort of harangues them about world revolution and about what it's going to be like. But does he really believe in that himself? It's unclear. Maybe he appears to think that this will happen at some point because that's historical inevitability, but whether it'll happen within his own lifetime, he seems less sure about that. And then suddenly, you have the February Revolution, and suddenly it's game on, and Lenin is searching for ways to get back to Russia, to be at the center of the revolution taking place in his homeland, and eventually he managed to get back by it's the whole thing seems fantastical, really, but he persuades the Germans, who are after all the great imperialist power of Central Europe. He persuades the Germans to allow him to go across their territory to return to Russia. And when he eventually does get to power himself after this very complex series of events in 1917, which lead up to ultimately the Bolshevik coup, I think it's really a coup as much as a revolution, then very soon the ideas of communism, the ideas of collective enterprise, they very soon get subsumed into how can we allow this regime to survive? And that turns out to be in a very, very top-down way of operations. And so really very, very early on, you see the Soviet Union, or it isn't even the Soviet Union yet, but you see the Bolshevik experiment being transformed from this idealized type into this much more grubby reality, where power depends on the secret police having guns, and the idea of Soviet democracy is really hollowed out.
That idea frightens a great number of Western countries, in America, in the UK, in France, in Germany. There's even though they sent Lenin over, their army is.
Well, this is classic blowback, right? And of course, there are people who are arguing about that in Germany in 1917 and saying, look, maybe we shouldn't let this guy Lenin go to Russia, because what if he were successful? Would that really be would it really be such a good thing to set up a Bolshevik regime at the fringes of the German Empire? And of course, that is how it ultimately plays out. So, in 1918, 1919, after the Soviet regime has been more or less established, but is very fragile, subject to civil war in Russia, then the great fear in Western Europe, and of course the United States as well, becomes, well, if it could happen in Imperial Russia, which everyone thought of as being the most backward state in Europe, then could it also happen here? And so you get the Red Scare, which really seeps from Russia into Western Europe and then across the Atlantic to the United States. And it's not really that idle, because of course it's true that the Bolsheviks do see Russia as a starting point, not an end point, for revolution.
Yeah, I mean, and you can understand the fear, because if the war machine, the wars rely on armies. Armies are made up of people. They're usually not from, the officers are from the high class, but you need the worker class for both military campaigns and to keep the economy humming, to keep the factories going. And so it's not such an idle fear. We may look at it now and say, it was overreaching, or perhaps, but if you're looking at America, and there are all of these war industries and people in factories that could be easily organized, and there are some genuine fears. J. Edgar Hoover makes his name. Attorney General Palmer has his raids. There's a lot going on in the United States. There's even a subject that has come up today, deportations that the United States engages in at that time.
Well, in June 1919, you get a bomb exploding outside the Attorney General's house. This is a major terrorist attack. You get body parts all over a very grand part of Washington, D.C., a message signed by the anarchist fighters. And you get a sense that actually not only could it happen over here, but maybe it is happening over here. And it's very hard to gauge how far that will go. Now, then, of course, what subsequently happens is Mitchell Palmer, massively, the Attorney General, massively overreaches in his response, and institutes essentially a dragnet operation to try and pull together as many foreign radicals as is possible, and to use U.S. immigration legislation in order to deport them. So there are all these raids where, for example, there's a pool hall in Pittsburgh which is raided, and a number of Russians are rounded up. A boarding house in Bridgeport, Connecticut. There's a theater in New York where they're all marched off to. The Russians are marched off to Battery Park and then taken to Ellis Island. And this is the sort of a process of, if you like, American history in reverse, being put into reverse by the Attorney General Mitchell.
How long had some of these people been in the country for? Were they recent, or
often for many years? They weren't American citizens. Had they been American citizens, then they would have had to have been released because of habeas corpus. But some had been there for a matter of months. Others had been there for several years. The notion that they were all somehow actually foreign radicals. I mean, some were foreign radicals, but the notion that they were all foreign radicals. The purpose here was to create an environment which was unwelcoming, and also to show that something was being done to help Mitchell Palmer's political career, of course, because he had ambitions to become president. And you've got somebody like J. Edgar Hoover in the background, who was also seeing the opportunity to advance his own career by stirring up the fear of the possibility of a communist takeover, and using whatever means are available in order to try and forestall that. And ultimately, that ends up with the deportation of some foreign radicals in December 1919. And remember, all of this with really very little in the way of due process. It's a power grab, essentially, by the Attorney General.
And do you have any sense of that? You think Palmer was going to be someone that was going to engage in this type of policy, or was it that explosion that changed him? Yeah, I wondered about that.
Well, I think anyone who's gone through an event like that, where you and your family are very nearly killed, I can see how that's going to have an effect on you. But I think my impression is he very quickly sees a political opportunity which arises from this. Not only a sort of a moral responsibility to defend the United States by acting in the way he does, by using all the tools at his disposal, whether that's justifiable or not. But I think he also spies a political opportunity, and that political opportunity is magnified by the fact, of course, that Woodrow Wilson himself is out of action because he suffers a stroke and he's debilitated. And so really there's this political vacuum which emerges at the end of 1919, in which the Red Scare can flourish, and in which Mitchell Palmer can more or less do whatever he wants. If were it not for the person against whom this ends up turning into sort of a grudge match between Mitchell Palmer and Louis Post, the Assistant Secretary of Labour. And ultimately, it's Lewis Post who then makes it impossible for Mitchell Palmer to advance along the lines that he'd intended, which is basically to use immigration law to deport pretty much anyone he chooses.
Do you get the sense that a healthy Woodrow Wilson would have stepped in there more, would have had a different policy?
It's hard to know, but yes, I do think so. I'm really no particular fan of Woodrow Wilson on lots of levels, but I think you see American politics becoming very unbalanced in 1919 and 1920, and I think that is a result of the absence of essentially the president having vacated the scene in effect. In the United States is a system which, after all, does revolve to a very great degree around the presidency.
What's it like writing a book like this? It's a large book. You're covering the whole world essentially. How'd you do it? And what is it like?
Well, it's a whole lot of reading, I can tell you that. But I mean, one of the great things about researching this particular period of history is that there are a huge number of diaries and memoirs and letters and other sources which one can draw upon to get a sense of not just the chain of historical events, but also the ways in which individuals experienced those events. Often if you're reading letters, for example, in particular, those kinds of sources, you get a sense of the human level detail, which I try to convey very much in the book, alongside the sort of the big, epoch changing political events. So, for example, if one of the characters I describe in the book is Sigmund Freud. It's extraordinary in a way to see this figure, the father of psychoanalysis, desperately writing to cousins in the United Kingdom, requesting that they send food parcels because in Vienna in 1919, the great father of psychoanalysis doesn't really have enough to eat. So, very often I wanted to use these sources, memoirs, diaries, letters, to get across the personal experience. It's not all about ideology. It's not all about big politics.
Do you think there's a link between politics and culture when describing this period, that some historians do, or is it just pure chaos?
I don't think it's ever pure chaos. I think if you look at at Dadaism or Surrealism, as artistic movements, they really reflect a disjointedness which was there in the world at the time. They reflect a loss of sense of sort of the natural center of things. I think that goes in these years, 1917 to 1924. And I think both the artistic and political currents which emerge from that, they're in a way they're two sides of the same. They're two sides of the same coin. They emerge from the same mess. They emerge from the same chaos. Which is one reason why I think it's important to look at them together. It's not to say there's some kind of direct causality between them, but often, ideologies such as fascism or communism, they're so huge in and of themselves that their trajectory is imagined or described as if it sort of existed in a vacuum, and it never exists in a vacuum. It always exists in connection with other events, social, scientific, cultural, which are going on in the world. You look at relativity, which is described by Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist. He describes fascism as being the most relativist phenomenon of the age. So here's somebody, Benito Mussolini, who in describing his political ideology is drawing on whatever the other currents are that are going on in the world. In the case of Surrealism, you have a very, very direct genesis in the World War itself, because the father of Surrealism, André Breton, is he's working in a psychiatric hospital in 1917. He observes shell-shocked patients coming back from the front, and this then becomes one of the inspirations for the ideas behind Surrealism. The idea is that it's important to connect with not the things that are said, not the things which are at the surface necessarily, but to try and dig deeper into the human psyche, to dig deeper into the unconscious, to do, if you like, in the arts what Freud is doing in psychoanalysis. I think all these things are linked.
The common view of the history of this time, and probably not enough time is spent on it, but a very common view is that Versailles got it wrong. We punished Germany, or the Allies punished Germany too harshly. and that changes in that might have changed what happened later. After doing this, do you have any different view from that kind of standard history?
Well, look, generally people think of Versailles as either being, either they say, look, it was too harsh and the Germans couldn't pay up, and so this was bound to have an effect in terms of the Germans viewing it as being, somehow illegitimate. And I think there's a big element of truth to the point about legitimacy, in the sense that many Germans never saw Versailles as being legitimate as a peace treaty, but not necessarily because they couldn't pay up, because they didn't accept the notion of full and exclusive blame for the war. But you have other things going on. You have, for example, and this is one of the interesting things that I was uncovering in the process of writing the book, you have on the other side of Europe, you've got somebody in Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who is essentially challenging the victory of the Allies in the First World War, is not prepared to accept the peace terms that they want to lay down, and ultimately successfully challenges them, so that what emerges in the East from the First World War is not at all what the Allies, Britain, France, and the United States had originally envisaged as being the peace settlement in the East. So you do have places where the peace settlement is challenged. Indeed, it is successfully challenged. And I think at the same time, you've got the fragmentation of the Allies. It's not just about the Versailles Treaty itself. It's about what happens after that, whether the Allies stick together and will actually impose the terms of that treaty. And of course, that's not what happens at all, because the United States doesn't sign up to the League of Nations, to some degree resiles from its responsibilities in Europe in a way which is the polar opposite of what happens in 1945, of course. And then also on the British and French side, very soon the tensions between the British vision of what should happen and the French vision of what should happen, their security interests and so forth, that reemerges. And so it's not just whether the treaty itself was good or bad, or whether it was fair or not. It's the challenges which emerge from outside, and also the question of whether the Allies themselves will stick together, which ultimately they don't, until, of course, it becomes a matter of life and death again in the Second World War.
Yeah, it's interesting. There were some that said we should have just kept marching. That the Allies, after the American expeditionary force had arrived and were stronger, should have marched to Berlin, and maybe that would have prevented it, or we could have been better at the peace table and it would have prevented it. So there's a lot to consider there. One of the notes from your book I noticed is that in a comment, Adolf Hitler, the early Adolf Hitler's using the fact that America hasn't joined the League of Nations as a invitation for his rhetoric, in a sense that, see, the Americans don't want to join the League. It's puny. They want to just rule by strength, and that's what Germany should do as well.
Well, that's a very apposite question in current geopolitics, right? Whether you want to create a world system in which, essentially the stronger you are, the more likely you are to get what you want, or whether you believe that you need to set out rules and norms and then abide by them in order to create the kind of world that you want to live in, where perhaps you don't need to rely on strength, military strength or other strength, in order to get what you want, which is the preferable world for you to live in. And that seems to me to be a very, very live argument at the moment, certainly in US politics, and to a degree, I think also in European and British politics.
Absolutely. I've been speaking with Charles Emmerson, and if you're looking on Amazon, that is Emerson with 2 M's. The book is Crucible, The Long End of the Great War and the Birth of a New World, 1917 to 1924. Charles, thanks so much for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's been a pleasure.